Hello everybody, we are going to be adding in particle effects to our project today. We'll use them for all sorts of things, and what you do with them is up to you. You can come up with all sorts of different ways to use this. So particle effects are basically things like explosions or fire that are generated from many small pieces, and so we're going to be programming a class to represent a single particle and then putting them together into things like fire and explosions and stuff. And we're going to be using mostly just rectangles for this, but feel free to experiment with using PNGs and all sorts of fun stuff. So we're making a particle class, and a particle is just going to be a game object, so we'll extend game object. And then we are going to go ahead and basically make another kind of bullet. It's going to look very similar to a bullet. We're probably going to give it one additional instance variable though, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So here's the constructor. The constructor is probably going to need to have some parameters because particles aren't going to know where to go automatically. We're going to want to have them happen at the engine of the spaceship or at the impact site of the collision. So it needs to be a flexible class that we can tell it what to do. So we're going to add in some parameters for x and y so we can tell it where to start. And we'll give it some parameters for vx and vy so we can tell it how fast and what direction to go in. I think eventually I'd like to add in color as well so we can tell it what color to be, but I'll leave that as an extension for you guys to work on. So I will make a instance variable here for, I think it can be a float, for alpha. We'll double check, and just in case this needs to be an int, we'll make that happen in a little bit. But I think it could be a float. So basically our alpha variable will keep track of transparency. That way we can have particles fade away, which will make for nice effects that we can accomplish. So here's our constructor, basically like all the other constructors that have parameters. Our object is just going to go where we told it to go and move in the speed and direction that we told it to go. Underscores probably would be helpful there. And then we can assign other things. So for example, width and height, we'll probably standardize. I don't know what a good number is for those off the top of my head, so we'll play around with it as we go. And you could also randomize these. It might be fun. We'll look at that coming up in a bit. So alpha, you can start it at a certain number. 255 means completely solid. You can also make them random so that different particles start at a different level of transparency to kind of shake them up a bit and give them some variety. But you can experiment with these things as we go forward. Let's see, I guess alive should be set to true as well. I think we actually do, yeah, I think that's important to do. Okay, great. So there's a constructor. I think that's all we have for that. It looks pretty similar if you go over and look at bullet. It doesn't have a good variable, but pretty much looks the same. So that's good. I'm hoping you're starting to see the patterns that are inherent in these. All these things, whether it's a particle or a bullet or an enemy. I mean, if you look at the enemies, pretty similar, right? They're all just variations on a single game object, a two-dimensional object in space. So that's why they're all very similar. You can have a show function, like all game objects, and I'm just going to make a rectangle at xw and it's width w wide and h tall. For now, I'll just fill it with 255 white, just for now, and we can modify that later on. So we'll have white particles. And then the ax functions are pretty basic. It's just going to move and also degrade or fade away. So the move code is very familiar. We've been doing that for months, so you probably got that ingrained in your mind. But then the alpha value, oh, I forgot to use alpha. Alpha is going to decrease. So alpha equals alpha minus, and then whatever number you want to use. I'll use 10. I forgot to actually use alpha, so in our show function, we want to go back and add that in over here. So don't forget to add that in. So fill 255, comma, alpha. When you give it two parameters, you can choose a level of transparency of that color as well. So that's how that works. So that's good. And now we're going to go on and put in the condition to die. And basically we'll have the particle die when it becomes completely transparent. So if alpha equals, or I guess I should say is less than or equal to, because if we go down by 10 and it starts at 255, we won't actually get to 0. Then we'll set alive to false. And don't forget to add in the extra alpha parameter in your fill function. So this is a perfectly reasonable particle. And now, well, I guess the magic really is where we add the particle in our game. So for example, if we wanted to have a bit of fire coming out of our engines, then we can make that happen. If we want like a burst of fire coming out as we fly around, that would be a pretty fun thing to add in. So what we'll do is we'll go to our spaceship, our starfighter, and we can add ourselves in a bit of code in the act function so that we are adding some fire. So what I'll do is I will say objects.add new particle, and I'll just choose to put it at the x and y of the spaceship. I'll give it a Vx of 0 and a Vy of 3, so it's going down. And it'll just basically produce particles that stream out the back of it, and they'll kind of fade away. Let's see if they do. There we go. Oh man, it's kind of amusing. It looks kind of like a weird Netflix logo flying through space. You can see they're sort of coming out and fading away as they go. It just looks like kind of a tail in some ways, because they're so uniform and they're just all kind of spreading out the same way. So let's shake it up a bit. Let's give it a Vx of a random number, so they kind of spread out with just a subtle Vx, just so we can see them as different. Also, I think it would be worthwhile to turn off their stroke. So the stroke right now in the particle class is currently set to nothing. So maybe putting in a no stroke. Now maybe I'll put in a no stroke right at the beginning of the game, actually. I'm going to add no stroke over here. Okay, so I'll run that, and then they'll kind of blend together a little bit more. It's almost a little more smoke at the moment, but that could be cool too. You could add in smoke as you take damage or something. I think that'd be pretty sweet to do. So, you know, not that it really makes sense for there to be the way this is. Well, I don't know. Maybe it makes sense for there to be gas, but it wouldn't. Well, I don't know. I guess it could be released if it was pressurized into this kind of cloud type of thing. But nonetheless, for our purposes, if we wanted to make it fire, we probably want to give it a bit more of a, engine location. So what I can do is move it down a bit. So if I want it to come out of the back of the spaceship, I can just move the y coordinate of where the particles start just down by half the height of the spaceship. And so now you'll see it's coming out of the bottom, and maybe got to go a little bit more because our particles are fairly big. So yeah, so it just kind of looks like it's burning, like it's on fire at the moment, but I'll leave it to you guys to sort of perfect some of those things. You don't have to use fire, by the way, but definitely find a way to use particles in yours. Here's another thing we can do. We can also use that same class to make explosions. So when a bad guy dies, what bad guys do I have? Right now I just have some fast enemies, I think. Yeah, I think these are fast enemies. So what I can do is I can add in some particles when they explode. So what I'll do is in the enemy class, we'll make an isAlive function for some of these guys. Our enemies right now don't have isAlive functions. We're just inheriting the original game object isAlive function, which is great. It just says return alive. If it's false, it returns false. If it's true, it returns true. So we'll probably add on to that a bit, and in, say, for example, I think I mostly have fast enemies. So, oh, you know what, since fast enemy extends enemy, maybe I'll just put it in enemy, and then they'll all get this new isAlive function. So we'll make a Boolean is alive, and we're doing this in enemy, the original enemy class. And I'll just say, hey, if alive is false, then what we'll do is return false. And else we'll return true. And that's not great on its own, but now we have a place where we can put some death animation or some death effects here. So before we've determined we're not alive anymore, we're about to return false. Before we do that, we can have something happen in the death throes of our enemy. So we can add in something like adding a fire. So I can say objects.add new particle, and I can say it'll happen at x and y, which will be the enemy's x and y because we're in the enemy class. And then I can make it sort of random. I can do a random -5, 5 for Vx, and a random number between -5 and 5 for the Vy. And it would add a particle before it died, which is fine. Oh, I missed a parenthesis. There we go. It won't be particularly spectacular, though. We'll just get one particle when it dies. But just to prove the idea, you can see the particles kind of fly off, just single particles. It's almost like the souls of the pilots. That's kind of morbid, but drifting off into space or something. That's kind of a morbid thought. But anyways, you know, that doesn't look like an explosion. So what we can do is just add a whole bunch. And as opposed to just like, I mean, I guess you could just copy and paste a bunch. But, you know, that's not great style. So instead what I'll do is make a loop. I'll just make this code happen like 10 times, 50 times, 100 times. So I'll say int I equals 0. And then while I is less than, and this is the number where you would choose how many particles. Let's say we want 100 particles. Then we would make the particle inside the loop, as well as say I equals I plus 1, or I plus plus. And that way, just when it's about to die, we found out alive is false, it'll go into a loop and it'll do this 100 times, make 100 new particles with random properties, and then return false. So before it dies, that happens. And somehow I managed to delete that parenthesis again. Here we go. So now take a look at what our explosions look like. Kaboom, kaboom. We're destroying them. Oh, interestingly, now it looks like they are impacting like bugs against a windshield along the bottom of the screen. That's a little bit awkward, hey? So it might not be the ideal place for these enemies to die anymore. So what we might want to do, it's kind of hard to distinguish between whether we died from a bullet or we died from the bottom of the screen. An easy way to solve that problem is just to make the bottom of the screen for the enemies a little bit lower so they can survive. You know, they'll die a little bit later on. So I believe that's right here. It's greater than height. So we'll just make it like 2 times height. So the enemies will survive underneath the screen a little bit longer. And technically, they'll still explode and die, which I'm not sure if that's super inefficient or not yet. But now, just at least we don't see the explosion happening. Yeah, so these things kind of explode when they get shot, and there's a ton of other possibilities that you guys can do with this. This particle effects is just sort of the beginning. So I've seen students do that, like this is smoke instead, and the amount of particles you're creating depends on your health. So you get like more and more smoke coming out of your damaged spaceship. You know, there's no fire exactly in space, but whatever, it's just not important. Not everyone's making a space game anyways. So that's great. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of other types of things that we can add in. So I'll let your imagination run wild and see what you can make. All right, thanks everybody. Enjoy that video.